So as we near the end of the course, we have yet another action film along the lines of Blade called Underworld. Probably Kate Beckinsale's most famous character in these films. She's not known for a great many other characters, but she is pretty well known for her role as Selene in the Underworld films. So a couple of starting points. It's important to know that when I refer to lichens, those are the werewolves in this film. Probably going to use them interchangeably, but I'm going to try to only say lichen because that's what they're called in the film. Though there is an interesting point when she defines lichen as werewolf. So there is a consciousness in the film that people don't get that intuitively. There haven't been many examples of strong female leads or heroes in vampire films that where the female is in fact a vampire. There have been some vampire hunters. We can think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, who was a strong female lead in that film. But I show you Queen of the Damned. That is another example of a strong female vampire, but it's hard to find many of those. So this film is unique in that respect. So this film actually spawned a few sequels. So the end of the film clearly signals that there will be additional films. So as action films often go, and you can kind of see this at the end of Blade as well, they want you to be aware that there will be additional films. And there were several related to the original Underworld film. So there was Underworld Evolution. There was Underworld Rise of the Lycans, which is actually a prequel, and Kate Beckinsale is not in it. And then there was an Underworld Awakening, a 3D film. So those were the kind of Underworld series. Like other sequels, some are better than others, but if you like one, you might very well like them all. So that last Underworld film was part of a kind of 3D movie TV craze that has kind of waned a significant amount. So televisions were being hawked for their 3D capability, despite the fact that there were enormous problems with that. So if you bought a 3D Panasonic television, for example, you might get a couple of sets of glasses to go with it. You might have to purchase them for anywhere from $50 to $100 each. And you had to have them for all the people that were watching the either television show or movie that you were watching in 3D. And if your friend had, say, a Sony 3D television, the Sony glasses didn't work with the Panasonic television. So it was a real problem, and I don't know if they're ever going to get past that. But you see less and less advertising related to 3D televisions. Some of them still have that technology in there. DirecTV kind of got out of the 3D business. They were putting forth a lot of 3D channels, and I don't think there was much uptake on that. And then, of course, 3D films are not for everyone. They're certainly not for me. I think they would make me motion sick. I get very motion sick, so I can't imagine that a 3D movie would be good for me. But there were lots of examples of recent movies that came out. So the Resident Evil 3D, Saw 3D, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D, Shark Night 3D, which I'm sure you all saw. Jackass 3D. Now, I've written about Jackass, and I actually did not see the third Jackass in 3D. By the time I saw it, the theater wasn't showing it in 3D anymore, so I actually saw a regular version of it, which was just fine. Glee 3D for whatever reason, Step It Up 3D, and probably one of the more famous 3D offerings was Avatar, and that was supposed to kind of help launch the 3D craze, and it did for a little while, but doesn't seem to have taken hold, and you don't really even see as many movies in 3D as you did, say, a few years ago. And then, of course, I'm sure all of you saw Argento's Dracula 3D, which is obviously a high-quality movie that was also in 3D, and one of our Dracula movies. Not that we watched, but a Dracula-themed 3D movie. So an interesting side note about Michael Sheen, who played Lucian in this movie. Not all that recognizable British actor, but he had an interesting trajectory in his career where he played British Prime Minister Tony Blair several times, and these are 3 examples of that. And you can see below, that's what Tony Blair looks like. A slightly older Tony Blair, and the resemblance isn't there as much as it was. But if you've seen Michael Sheen in any of these movies and you knew what a kind of younger Tony Blair looked like, there was actually a striking resemblance. And then, of course, he went on to the Underworld movies. But still an interesting part of his career. So one of the things I want to point out about perspective, and Prince talks about eyeline match, and he talks about point of view in a couple of chapters, 5 and 11. But anytime you see something from the kind of first person perspective, that's an intentional act on the part of the director to make you feel like you are the character. And these chase scenes where it goes from what is a third person perspective to a first person perspective are to some degree disorienting, but uh, does kind of put you more in the film. And in many ways, I think Underworld is almost like a video game. And if you believe that, these kinds of perspectives are very much like what are done in first person shooter video games. So I think that there's a connection there. But I just wanted to offer this as an example of a point of view that Prince talks about in the textbook. So Prince talks about special effects. He refers to them as visual effects in chapter 8. And I would encourage you to go back to chapter 8 and read what Prince says, particularly about visual effects. So I offer these kind of transformation shots as a good example of what Prince is talking about, because clearly these are digital effects. Clearly they're special effects. And of course it ends with a different perspective and a different shot. But this is a film where special effects play a fairly prominent role, especially in these kind of transformation scenes that we haven't seen in other films that we've watched. So what Prince says about visual effects is that they began in the 60s and 70s and were a product of research done at universities, corporations, and government, how to incorporate digital effects into visual mediums. He cites Jurassic Park as one of the first films to really deploy digital effects successfully. He cites a few examples of some other films that were less than successful that did use some digital effects, but Jurassic Park had a fairly significant box office, was a fairly popular film, and did use quite a few different kinds of digital effects. What Prince says is that filmmakers use digital tools to build on the traditional style of filmmaking. So one of the fears that's out there is that digital filmmaking will completely replace the style that we know, the narrative of filmmaking, and that hasn't happened yet. So Prince makes it a point to note that even though people are using digital tools more and more, films are still what we expect them to be in terms of narrative and in terms of the cinematic feel. He cites a few different kinds of digital techniques, and you should know how each of them are used. So he talks about animatronic models, digital composites, rendering, multipass composing, camera mapping, and a maquette. So each of those are defined in the textbook, and I would encourage you to go back and see what each of those entails and how they're different and how they can interact with each other. Ultimately, you can't overuse digital effects to save a movie, according to Prince and according to most people. So if the narrative is bad, it doesn't really matter what kinds of special effects you have. It's still a bad movie. So it's important to note that digital visual effects are not really the most important aspect of filmmaking. You still need a good story. So there are not many what I would describe as dramatic vampire entrances, but I cite a couple here. So our first shot of Celine as a kind of vampire. I mean, the beginning of this film, you don't even really know until this moment that you are really dealing with vampires. You can kind of see her fangs there. So at that moment, she enters as a vampire. Before that, she's just kind of someone shooting up a bunch of people in a subway. And of course, Victor's entrance is pretty dramatic as well, and a little bit gross, especially when you see the wires attached to him that are kind of infusing him with blood. But these are the moments that we see these vampires for the first time. And again, I think the point of noting vampire entrances is that vampires appear on screen as part of the narrative in a different way than other characters in other films. It is a significant narrative moment when the vampire appears, and you don't have that in all other kinds of stories, and that's why I think it's interesting to point them out here, and as I've pointed them out in some of our other films. So Underworld has some similarities and differences from other vampire narratives that we have been exposed to. So we find out that light hurts these vampires. So there you see Victor's daughter getting ready to be destroyed by sunlight. So light is still a problem. The UV bullets that we see are very similar to what we saw in Blade. So again, it's a version of light hurting. It's just light in a bullet, and Blade had those as well. Uh, a noteworthy difference, these vampires cast a reflection. And this scene, when Celine is walking back towards the tomb, I would argue is an intentional moment to emphasize that she casts a reflection, because there's really no narrative necessity for any of this. She'll disappear, and the guy behind the glass will appear and open the door for her, and whatever it is they're doing down there. But I think the whole point of this particular shot is to show that she casts a reflection and that this is a different kind of vampire. But there's no evidence that she's not fully a vampire. She's fully a vampire and yet casts a reflection, unlike many other vampires we've seen. So I think it's important to note here, this is a kind of fleeting shot, and we have a few of them of the vampire castle, where all the vampires are kind of hanging out. And to me, it's very much like looking at Dracula's castle. Uh, Again, combining kind of the new narrative and the old narrative at the same time. Certainly, the guy there with a gun would suggest that this is more of a new narrative. But I am intrigued by the fact that we have this kind of long shot of a castle that, if you were to juxtapose it next to our shots of Dracula's castle, wouldn't look all that different. So I think that's another intentional brief moment in the film to harken back to traditional vampire narratives. If the vampires were hanging out somewhere else, for example, in a house or a trailer or something like that, it would be a little different. But for us and for many other viewers, the traditional vampire, and these are the European aristocratic vampires, are hanging out in a castle. I thought it would be useful to point out this scene. So the scene where she escapes by shooting holes in the floor and then the floor collapses. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the show Mythbusters, but Mythbusters decided to take this film scene on and try to see if it is reproducible. As I've said before, the new PowerPoint interface doesn't really let me embed YouTube clips as I could have in the past. So I have included in content a Mythbusters section that includes a YouTube video of them doing this scene on the show. And the short version is it's not possible. But if you want a little bit of entertainment, go to the content section and watch that YouTube clip, and you can see them try in vain to reproduce this in real life. Again, films are films and special effects are special effects, but Mythbusters likes from time to time to see if film special effects are reproducible. Uh, this is another vampire film where we have some family issues. So certainly Victor is both father figure, and we come to find out later, murderer of Celine's family, and we also find out that he turned her into a vampire. So he's father figure and lover, and she wakes him up. So it's clear that she's got a bunch of daddy issues, for lack of a better term, with Victor, that she solves in the end by slicing his head in half. And this was kind of the most tame shot I could offer. If it happened to gross you out that his head got sliced in half, you know what comes right after this scene. But again, the vampire family, it's not clear what some of the other vampires are to her. Are they lovers? Are they siblings? Are they just friends? But Victor is most clearly portrayed as her father, and it's very clear in the end how she deals with him. He'll make an appearance in the Underworld prequel, Rise of the Lycans, but we don't obviously. He gets killed in this particular film. A few other things that I think are worth pointing out. I enjoy early in the film when we see this kind of Lycan fight club when they're in the sewers fighting. It to me is very much a Fight Club scene. Um, for a vampire film, there's not a whole lot of biting in here, which I think is pretty interesting. In fact, this bite is very late in the film, almost towards the end. So these vampires seem to like to shoot a bunch of people and fight with lichens, but don't seem to do a lot of biting and transforming of humans or of anyone else for that matter. Little point about music that we saw in the police car. So the two kind of, they're not real police officers, but when they are taking Michael and he's transforming into a lichen, for some reason they seem to think that music will make that easier on all of them. So they turn the radio up really loudly, and we can hear it obviously, and so can the characters in the film. Kind of rare instance in this film of diegetic music. Not many other instances of that, and it's not something we see a lot of. Haven't seen a lot of, at least in our previous, most recent films. I also find the battle scenes in these films to be particularly confusing. So it's clear that the vampires are kind of wearing long leather coats, and these guys are kind of in jackets and jeans, the lichens. But I have a hard time following who's shooting who, what team is what. It's all a big mess. The movie itself is very dark, visually very dark. And they seem to be shooting similar weapons. They don't seem to come out in a different, the bullets that is, in a different color. So I just find the whole thing very disorienting. And I'm not sure if that's intentional or not. Sometimes movie makers will be kind of intentionally disorienting to kind of throw you off your balance as you're watching a movie. And I don't know if that's intentional here or not, but anytime, you know, groups of lichens and groups of werewolves are shooting at each other, or groups of lichens and groups of vampires are shooting at each other, I have a hard time keeping up with who's who. But I just thought that's worth pointing out. I do enjoy this little joke about the bullets infused with silver nitrate. So, you know, the mythology is the way to kill a werewolf is to shoot it with a silver bullet, and these bullets have silver nitrate in them. So that's the silver bullet that they use in this film. Again, it's kind of a joke and kind of a piece of technology in the film, but I always chuckle a little bit to myself when she points out the silver nitrate in the bullets. So for the article that we read by Magulik is really critiquing three television series, Xena Warrior Princess, La Femme Nikita, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And for Magulik, these particular narratives are really more about male fantasy than they are about what we would think of as kind of progressive feminism or strong female characters. And she has many reasons for citing that. But I think it's important to note that for Magulik, the media really liked these shows, and you know, kind of mainstream critics thought that these were great role models, these were new female heroes, these were narratives to celebrate. And what Magulik is saying is they are not. Part of the reason that Magulik cites for their popularity is there weren't really a whole lot of other female heroes out there, so that these were not only these were not the best examples, but they really were the only examples of female heroes, and that's kind of what people were stuck with, so that's what people kind of gravitated to. For Magulik, these women are all controlled or formed by men. So men have given them their strength, men have helped them channel and hone their powers. There's kind of a real uncomfortable relationship that these female leads have with the men in their lives. Sometimes they're lovers, sometimes they're fathers, sometimes they're threats, if you know these narratives at all. And sometimes they're all those at the same time. And it's just very disturbing when you think about it. Many of the men in these shows physically threaten the female characters, and they ultimately have to, the female characters have to fight these men. And for Magulik, that doesn't really demonstrate a kind of progressive narrative. These female heroes are physically, emotionally, and mentally abused in their narratives, and there's a fair amount of humiliation that they undergo as well. In many ways, humiliation is a feminized position. So we don't when we see men in narratives humiliated, that you know, in film theory and television theory feminizes them, and we often see women humiliated, and that's a feminizing position. And if you need a kind of concrete example of that, You can think of a show like I Love Lucy, where Lucy was consistently humiliated in the narrative of that show. That was the position that she was in, to be humiliated. And for some critics, that's particularly troubling. And in these shows, McGulick finds that somewhat disturbing. These heroes sometimes rely on their sexuality for success. So, what McGulick says is that these characters are fantasies of male writers. They are hypersexualized, and they're punished for their strength and independence. She cites in particular, how Buffy ends up at the end of that series is kind of really scarred emotionally, and that what she goes through in the course of that narrative is particularly troubling when you take it in its totality. People like to point to particular episodes and say, oh, that wasn't that bad here, or it wasn't that bad there. But in totality, Buffy really suffers a lot, as do Xena and Nikita. They are punished and sexualized in what we would consider to be routine patterns. So there's nothing particularly progressive about these storylines in terms of their punishment or their sexualization. So, what are some of the key takeaways from Underworld? Well, it's one of very few examples of female vampires as the hero or the lead. So I think that makes this narrative significant. It is a film that spawned several sequels, and we've talked in the past about the importance of sequels and how they figure into film appreciation. Underworld is an action movie as much as it is a vampire movie, not unlike Blade. But it does play within some of the rules of vampires. It breaks some of the rules of vampires. You can see in that shot below, that's the kind of vampire party, and they're supposed to be drinking blood. And if you didn't get that, there are wires, transfusion wires, sending blood down. So these are clearly vampires, and they're clearly fighting lichens, which we know are werewolves. So there's a mythology there that they play with, but it's still an action movie, and more, I would argue, an action movie than maybe a vampire movie. And from the article that we read, strong women heroes are rare in popular culture, and their depiction is not as straightforward as one would like. So just because you have a female lead as a hero doesn't mean that the narrative is progressive, and doesn't mean that it is doing good cultural work.